Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. I'm pleased to introduce the second of a three-part video series on the book of Isaiah from our 2016 Let's Know the Bible Conference held in northern Indiana. In this second video, Dr. Chisholm examines two passages from Isaiah that are often referred to as Messianic passages because later in the New Testament, they are applied to Jesus. So prepare yourself as Dr. Chisholm addresses how to understand Isaiah's Messianic passages.
This session I'd like to deal with three very famous passages. Isaiah 7, but that really includes chapter 8 through verse 10. So we'll be looking at Isaiah 7:1 through 8:10, which is the Immanuel prophecy. And this is the one part of our morning where things could get a little more technical. And as we talk about how was that prophecy designed and fulfilled. We're also, Lord willing, going to be looking at the Messianic titles in Isaiah chapter 9, but we need to look at the context there as well. And then a wonderful passage, Isaiah chapter 11, where the Lord transforms the animal kingdom as part of his kingdom of justice and peace. So that's where we're heading. As Herb said, we're beginning on page 13. I'll try to make sure all the blanks get filled in. I know I missed some on the first session. But Isaiah chapter 7, again, we have to look at the historical context here. And at this point in time, the Assyrian menace is out there. And we mentioned this briefly before. The northern kingdom of Israel and the Aramean kingdom to the east and northeast have decided to oppose the Assyrians, and they have formed an alliance. And they want Judah down in the south. Ahaz is the king, very young fellow. He's a young guy. I don't think he was really ready for this kind of a challenge. He's the king of Judah, and they are threatening him, saying, if you do not join our alliance, we will remove you from the throne, and we will put someone else in your place. That's a threat on God's promise to the Davidic dynasty, by the way. I mean, the arrogance of this. So there is a threatening invasion. The Arameans and the Israelites are going to invade Judah to try to force them to join the alliance. But then there's also the Lord's promise in chapter 7, verse 7. For this reason, the sovereign master, the Lord, says, it will not take place. It will not happen. And then he talks about the fact that the Arameans' leader is Damascus. The leader of Damascus is Rezin. Who are these guys? They're going to be gone before we know it. And then he says, you need to trust in the Lord. If your faith does not remain firm, then you will not remain secure. So there is a challenge to Judah to trust the Lord, who has promised that he will deliver them from this threat in the years ahead. But then we have Ahaz's response to all of this in chapter 7, verses 10 through 12. B on page 14 is Ahaz's rejection of a confirming sign. The Lord again spoke to Ahaz, ask for a confirming sign from the Lord your God. You can even ask for something miraculous. In the text, you can make it as high as heaven or as low as Sheol below. You can ask for anything. So the Lord offers him a sign and says, you can make it anything you want. It can be miraculous. Signs aren't always miraculous, by the way. If you study the Hebrew word for a sign, you discover it can be used of a lot of things. Object lessons, tangible reminders. It doesn't always have to be a miracle. But in this case, I think the Lord opens the door for anything. It can be something amazing. But then Ahaz responds, I don't want to ask. I don't want to put the Lord to a test, which sounds very pious, but the fact of the matter is the Lord has offered him this sign, and I don't think there would have been anything wrong with him asking for it. So we have Isaiah's challenge and then Ahaz's refusal. But the Lord then gives Ahaz a confirming sign. Okay, if you won't ask for one, I'll give you one. Verse 13, so Isaiah replied, pay attention, family of David, house of David. The house of David is just the royal court at this point in time. Earlier in the chapter, the house of David is trembling. The house of David exists at this point in time. We're not talking about some future kings. The family of David at this point in time. Pay attention, family of David. Do you consider it too insignificant to try the patience of men? Is that why you are also trying the patience of my God? You don't want to test him, but you're trying his patience. And he's my God. I'm not so sure he is yours, Isaiah says. For this reason, and this is the famous verse, for this reason, the sovereign master himself will give you a confirming sign. Look, this young woman is about to conceive and will give birth to a son, and the way we translate it in that Bible is, you, young woman, will name him Immanuel, as if this is addressed to her. Another option would just be, and she will name him Immanuel. There's some debate there over what's going on with the Hebrew form. And this is the verse, of course, that's quoted in the New Testament as a proof text related to Jesus' virgin birth. And so I think some people say, well, the sign is a virgin conception. A virgin is going to miraculously conceive and have this child who is going to be the God-man. Immanuel, Immanu, with us, is El, God, is what the name means. And that's typically the way it is interpreted, as if Isaiah was directly predicting the virgin birth 700 years in advance. Okay? And a lot of people, a lot of good people, a lot of my friends interpret it this way. As you'll see, I have a little bit of a different way of looking at this. But I don't think the sign ends there. The sign doesn't end there. You've got to look at the context. And verse 15, he will eat sour milk and honey, which will help him know how to reject evil and choose what is right. So the he will eat sour milk, it seems to be talking about Immanuel. Okay, so this child is going to eat a certain diet and by eating that diet, it's going to facilitate him choosing good and evil, choosing between right and wrong. So it looks to me like the sign is continuing here. Verse 16, here is why this will be so. So Isaiah's reply switches from Ahaz to the house of David. Isaiah's reply evidences Ahaz's trying of God's patience. Isaiah's reply reveals God's sign, and Isaiah's reply outlines the confirmation of God's sign. I just wanted to fill in the blanks for you. And so let's keep reading on. I'll just kind of comment as we go. Here's why this will be so. Before the child knows how to reject evil and choose what is right, the land whose two kings you fear will be desolate. It sounds like the sign is relating to the threat that is upon Ahaz. The Arameans and the Israelites are the two nations. And before he gets to a certain age, this will happen. Looks like the child needs to be there for the sign to function. We need to be watching the growth pattern of the child to see what's going to happen. The Lord will bring on you, your people, and your father's family a time unlike any since Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. And this is very ironic because I think what the Lord wanted to do for Ahaz, he wanted to deliver his people. And he, pure and simple, and he wanted to give him a sign that that was going to be the case. Ahaz said, no, I don't want to test the Lord. We discover from other texts that Ahaz had decided to become pro-Assyrian. He invited the Assyrians in to take care of this problem rather than trust the Lord. And so now potential salvation is going to get turned into judgment. Potential blessing is going to become punishment. And so, the Lord is going to deliver you from this immediate threat, the Arameans and the Israelites. But guess what? The Assyrians are going to come on the scene. And you are going to experience a time that we haven't experienced in a long, long time, the oppressive rule of the Assyrians. And so the whole thing gets turned on its head here, as potential blessing is turned into judgment. And then in verses 18 through 25, page 15, the Lord explains the sign. If you had any doubt about this, God is going to bring this calamity upon Judah, and their sovereign God will allow Assyria to devastate the land. Verse 18, at that time the Lord will whistle for flies from the distant streams of Egypt, and for bees from the land of Assyria. The Egyptians and the Assyrians are going to be showing a great interest in you. The Egyptians want Judah as a buffer against the Assyrian onslaught. The Assyrians want it as a launching pad so they can invade Egypt. All of them will come and make their home in the ravines between the cliffs and in the crevices of the cliffs, in all the thorn bushes and in all the watering holes. At that time, the sovereign master will use a razor hired from the banks of the Euphrates River, the king of Assyria, to shave the head and the pubic hair. It will also shave off the beard. So the Assyrians are going to be God's instrument of judgment against Judah, because you, Ahaz, were unwilling to believe and trust in the Lord. At that time, a man will keep alive a young goat cow from the herd and a couple of goats. From the abundance of milk they produce, he will have sour milk for his meals. That's where the sour milk is coming from. Doesn't look like we're going to have a whole lot of crops available. Well, we'll have some goats here that'll produce some milk for us. At that time, every place where there had been 1,000 vines worth 1,000 shekels will be overrun with thorns and briars. With bow and arrow, men will hunt there, for the whole land will be covered with thorns and briars. They will stay away from all the hills that were cultivated for fear of the thorns and briars. Cattle will graze there, and sheep will trample on them. See what's happening? This child is going to be born. He's going to be a reminder that God is with us. God wanted to be with them in salvation and deliverance, but because of Ahab's lack of faith and his failure to respond properly, the Lord, he's going to deliver them from the immediate threat, but he's then going to bring the Assyrians through. And little Immanuel is someday going to be eating milk and honey. And as he eats those things, he's going to be saying to himself, this is what happens when you disobey God. Judgment comes upon you. Okay? So in the context, I think that's the sign. It's a timing sign. Before he reaches this age, this is what God will accomplish among his people. And what he accomplished, and when you look at this child, you will be reminded that God is indeed with us, potentially for salvation, but also in judgment. So it's a very negative sign in this context. In chapter 8, verses 1 through 10, I think you have a parallel passage. The Lord told me, the prophet is told, take a large tablet, inscribe these words on it with an ordinary stylus. Maher Shalal Hashbaz, which is a name that you probably don't want to say a lot. It's a long name. Swift to the plunder, quick to the loot is the idea. It conjures up an image of judgment, plundering, looting. An enemy army is going to plunder you, and this child is going to be given this symbolic name. A little bit later in this chapter, Isaiah says, I and my children are signs from the Lord. Our names are symbolic. Remember, he had an earlier child named Sha'ar Yeshuv, a remnant will return. Then I will summon as my reliable witnesses Uriah the priest and Zechariah son of Jeberechiah. I then had sexual relations with the prophetess, presumably his wife. She conceived and gave birth to a son. The Lord told me, name him Maher Shalal Hashbaz. For before the child knows how to cry out, my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus, the plunder of Samaria will be carried off. This is kind of parallel to what we saw in the previous chapter. There's a sign child who's born. Some people will even argue that Maher Shalal Hashbaz and Immanuel are one and the same. Others will say, no, Immanuel was a child in the royal court to remind them of certain truths. Maher Shalal Hashbaz is a parallel child. But they're both signs that involve timing. Before he even gets to this age, the Lord will have delivered his people from this immediate threat, the Israelites and the Arameans. Then the Lord spoke to me again. These people have rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloach and melt in fear over what's seen in the son of Remaliah. So look, the sovereign master is bringing up against them the turbulent and mighty waters of the Euphrates River. And he goes on to describe the flood that's going to occur. The Assyrians are going to sweep into the land. See, it's just like chapter 7. There's going to be an immediate deliverance, but then the Assyrians are going to sweep in, and blessing and salvation are going to quickly be transformed into judgment. And then at the end of verse 8, the Assyrian flood is sweeping through the land, and then the Assyrian is going to spread his wings out over your entire land. Look what it says. O Immanuel. The child is addressed. Immanuel, the child from chapter 7, is addressed. Ironically, oh, God is with us. Yeah, he's with us all right in judgment as he brings the Assyrians upon us. But then Isaiah quickly shifts. He does this a lot. He'll go from judgment to salvation just like that. Even though the Assyrians are going to invade and they're going to do a lot of damage, verses 9 and 10 talk about the fact that the Lord is eventually going to turn them back. The Assyrian armies, who had peoples from a variety of nations, are going to come against the Lord's people, but the Lord is going to turn them back. Verse 10, devise your strategy, but it will be thwarted. Issue your orders, but they will not be executed. This is anticipating 701, where Sennacherib is defeated. Why? Because Immanuel, God is with us. So see the pattern here? God is with us initially in deliverance, but unfortunately because of Ahaz's unbelief in judgment, but eventually God is with us is going to be a positive sign because God will ultimately deliver us from the Assyrian invader. So as you can see, I kind of took the child as a sign who was functioning in this historical context. Okay. So how does this line up with Matthew? Am I some kind of liberal for suggesting this? On page 23 in your book, we have an excursus. We didn't want to put it in the notes proper because it takes up so much space, but it's important and we need to go there. Okay, to this excursus, where I talk about how this sign is fulfilled. And some people are going to say, well, Isaiah 7:14 is just a prediction of the virgin birth. Well, we just read through the context. How would that, it occurred 700 years later, how would that be a sign to anyone in Isaiah's time? It's clear that the sign, the birth of this child, Immanuel, is related to what's going on in Isaiah's day. That child is a sign that's attached to certain events. And people could look at him and say, oh yeah, there's Immanuel over there. God is with us. And all that means in our historical context. And so I've actually had the experience of talking with Jewish folks about this passage. And for the life of them, they don't understand how we can do what we do with Isaiah 7:14. They'll say, look at verses 15 and 16. This isn't talking about the virgin birth of Jesus. This is talking about something that happened in the historical context. How would you answer them if they were to say that to you? Well, we're going to try to give you an explanation here that will bring all of this together. I don't think we have to pick and choose. I think there was an historical child, Immanuel, who was a sign, a reminder to the people that God was indeed with them, but he is a foreshadowing. We could maybe use the word type. He is a type, a foreshadowing of a greater child to come, who in the progress of Revelation we discover he is God with us in a much fuller sense. And I think that's already hinted at in the context of Isaiah, because the next passage we're going to look at in chapter 9, we have this great king who's going to arise, that God is going to raise up. In the historical context, they may have attached the hope to Hezekiah. If so, they were disappointed. So there may have been an initial historical reference, but the Messianic king, whose titles are given in chapter 9, one of his titles is El Gabor. God is going to be working in him and empowering him so much that when you see him on the battlefield, it's as if you're fighting God himself. So there's this greater child who's going to be born in chapter 9. And I'm arguing that the historical Immanuel in chapter 7 foreshadows this greater individual to come who's described in chapter 9 and then again in chapter 11. who's going to be God with us in a fuller sense, and we come to understand the full significance of that as we get into the New Testament. That's what's going on here, typology. And so Matthew, understanding all of this, can take a promise about the first Immanuel and apply it to the second Immanuel. Okay, that's it in a nutshell. But you may not be buying this. So one of the things I like to do when I work through this passage is talk about how Matthew uses the Old Testament in this context. Does he look at the Old Testament and say, the prophet predicted this and it's fulfilled in Jesus? Or is it more subtle? Is there typology at work, an analogy? And I would argue that in Matthew's other uses of the Old Testament, right in these chapters, he is utilizing the Old Testament more in the way that I have suggested he's using Isaiah 7. So let's just bracket Isaiah 7 for the moment, as controversial as it is, because it's such a prominent quotation in the New Testament. Let's look at some other uses of the Old Testament by Matthew in this context. Because we can assume, well, if he's using the Old Testament this way in these other passages, maybe he's doing the same thing with Isaiah 7:14. Fair enough? So Hosea 11:1 in Matthew 2:15. Remember, Jesus and his family went down to Egypt to escape. And this was to fulfill what the prophet Hosea had said. And if you go over to Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, we have the passage that's quoted. Out of Egypt I called my son. If you were just reading Matthew and you're working with a simple prediction, fulfillment. In other words, the prophet looks into a crystal ball and sees what's going to happen hundreds of years in advance and describes it. You might think Hosea was predicting how Jesus would go into Egypt and then come out again. Let's see if that's true. Hosea 11:1. When Israel was a young man, I loved him like a son, and I summoned my son out of Egypt. What's the tense here? It sounds past to me. And then verse 2 really clinches this. You're going to have a hard time applying verse 2 to Jesus. But the more I summoned them, the farther they departed from me. They sacrificed to the Baal idols and burned incense to images. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Yet it was I who led Ephraim. I took them by the arm, but they did not acknowledge that I had healed them. And then he goes on to explain that they're going to have to go back into exile. They're going to return to Egypt. Assyria will rule over them, and the Lord is going to have to judge them. So in this context, Hosea 11:1, first of all, it's not future, it's past. Right? This is something that God has already done with Israel, his son. And it's not messianic. It's talking about Israel, the nation that failed, that disobeyed God and then had to be judged. So, what is Matthew doing? Well, I think there's typology, there's pattern at work. Matthew understands that Jesus is the new ideal Israel. By the way, that comes from Isaiah. That comes from Isaiah 49 in particular, the second servant song, where the servant is called Israel, but yet he saves Israel. So Israel is saving Israel. What is going on there? We'll talk about that next hour. But I think Matthew understands the significance of Jesus as the new ideal Israel. And so God in his providence establishes a pattern. Just as the historical Israel went down to Egypt, his son Israel, so his son, the new ideal Israel, Jesus, is going to follow that pattern. He is going to emerge from Egypt as the new Israel. And so in the providence of God, it's a way of God indicating just who Jesus is. Remember what Jesus does. He goes into the wilderness, ring a bell? And he faces temptation from the devil. And how does he emerge victorious? Quoting Deuteronomy. And quoting passages from Deuteronomy that are in the context of Israel's failure in the wilderness. And so where the old Israel failed, the new Israel will succeed. This is typology. When Matthew says this needs to be fulfilled, he means the pattern needs to be filled out. He's not thinking of prediction hundreds of years before that gets fulfilled. Because if you take it that way, Hosea 11:1 in its context, it's clearly talking about the Exodus. But Jesus is the new Israel. And so the pattern that we saw with the old Israel is repeated with the new Israel. But the new Israel succeeds where the old Israel failed. Jesus in the wilderness is in stark contrast to Israel in the wilderness, always complaining, failing, and eventually not being allowed into the land. So see how Matthew is using the Old Testament there? On page 24, we've got another one, Jeremiah 31:15. This is where Herod kills the children, the infants in Bethlehem, because he has heard that the Messiah is going to come from Bethlehem, and so he decides to kill all the kids. Jesus, of course, escapes. And then Matthew says, this fulfills Jeremiah 31:15. Well, if you go to the Jeremiah 31 context, we don't have time to read all these contexts. What you see is that it's not talking about what Herod did hundreds of years later in Bethlehem. In the context, we've got Rachel weeping for her children because they have been taken from her into exile. And he goes on to explain, but someday the kids are all going to come back. The ones that Herod killed didn't come back like that. It's talking about something that happened in Israel's experience when the Assyrians and or the Babylonians took the people into exile. And there was great weeping because the children were gone. They were gone into exile. So what is Matthew doing? Well, again, I think he's seeing a pattern of oppression in this case. You know, there's always some ruler who is oppressing God's people. It was true back then, and it's as if it is happening again here as Herod slaughters the infants in Bethlehem. So it's more like a foreshadowing, a typology or an analogy that is created there. It's not that Jeremiah was predicting specifically what would happen in Herod's day. And then Jesus the Nazarene, Jesus goes and lives in Nazareth so that this can be fulfilled. He'll be called a Nazarene. No one can find that passage in the Old Testament. Some try to see it as Isaiah 11:1, a little wordplay that's involved. But I think it's just saying he's going to suffer. It's an allusion to the suffering servant motif because of the way Nazareth was viewed at this point in time. At least insignificant, maybe even worse. What good thing can come from there? So I would argue that Matthew, in these chapters, in chapter 2, uses the Old Testament in a very, shall we say, creative way, legitimate way, but there's typology, there's analogy at work. There was an historical referent that foreshadowed, was analogous to Jesus in some way. And I would say that he's using Isaiah 7:14 in the same way. That the historical Immanuel who lived in Isaiah's time was a reminder that God is with us. Within the context of Isaiah itself, that child foreshadows a greater child to come, described in chapter 9, this great king. And Jesus comes along and he is the child predicted. Ultimately, the child predicted in Isaiah 9 that Immanuel foreshadowed. So we can take the language that was used for the first Immanuel and apply it to the second Immanuel in kind of a heightened sense. And via the virgin birth, Jesus is God with us, the God-man in the flesh, something that the first Immanuel wasn't. He was just a reminder that God is with us. You may have some questions about that when the time comes, so we'll move on. That's the way I see it. And if you want to read in more detail the excursus, I would invite you to read through that. So in chapter 8, the Lord reiterated the sign, the Lord's instruments. The Lord instructs Isaiah to write the words Maher Shalal Hashbaz. I'm filling in the gaps for you. Invasion, the Lord spoke of the coming invasion, but there's a glimmer of hope. There's a taunting of Assyria. Jerusalem will be protected. And that leads us into Isaiah chapter 9, where he sees a reversal of the judgment that came through the Assyrians. The darkness of judgment in chapter 9 would not cover the land forever. Page 18. Judgment is going to be reversed. Where there was once darkness, there's going to be light. The Lord is going to bring light. Remember, when Jesus shows up in Galilee, this passage is related to his ministry. The light has come. dispelling the darkness in verse 2, and then a joyous outburst in verse 3. So there's going to be this reversal. And then page 19, the Davidic king who will remove the Assyrian yoke. And we have the oppressive Assyrian yoke will be removed, and then there's God's promise of a son that includes royal titles. So we want to look at Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6 and 7. That'll be our focus here for the next few minutes. Okay. At where these titles are given. And verse 6 is a very famous passage. It shows up in Handel's Messiah, right? For a child has been born to us. It is the birth of a child. See, and this helps make the connection between Immanuel, who was a child who was born, and this king. It helps us make that connection. It facilitates the typology, we could say. A son has been given to us. He shoulders responsibility and is called. And these are his messianic titles. Now in Handel's Messiah, it's Wonderful, Counselor. There's 5 titles. I think it's better to see 4 titles. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. See the symmetry? Each title has 2 parts to it. And so Wonderful Counselor, what in the world does that mean? I translated it in Net Bible, Extraordinary Strategist, which is a little bit different. Counselor, when I think of a counselor, I think maybe of an attorney, a Perry Mason counselor, or in these days, a psychology guy. You know, my son and his wife are professional counselors. So you go to somebody for help, counselor. I'm not so sure counselor is a real good word here. In this context, what has happened? This king has delivered God's people from the oppressive Assyrians, the oppressive Gentile rule. It's a military context. He's going to win a great victory like in the day of Midian, when Gideon defeated the Midianites. Remember that? It's a context of war. And so I think what we're talking about here is a king who has the capacity to devise extraordinary strategies for battle. Robert E. Lee, extraordinaire, come up with great strategies. I think that's what's in view here. A wonderful counselor, I think, may kind of miss the point. Mighty God. Now, you could look at this and say, whoa, that's predicting the deity of the Messiah. I'm not so sure ancient Israel would have seen all of that at their point in time. There's this concept in the ancient Near East that a mighty king who's under the authority of a god, the god would empower the king for battle. We actually have scenes where the god is giving the king certain weapons and then empowers him for battle. I remember there's one text where the Egyptians and Hittites are fighting and the Egyptian king is boasting. Ramses is boasting about what happened. And he said, when the Hittites saw me on the field of battle, they said, "This is no mere man. The gods have invaded his body and are fighting through him." I think that's probably as far as ancient Israel would have gone. They would have seen this as this king is going to be energized by God, so that when he shows up on the field of battle, it's as if God himself is going to be fighting. This is El Gibor. Gibor is a word for might or warrior. But of course, in the progress of Revelation, as things begin to unfold and we more clearly see who Jesus is, the God-man, we see more in that title than I think probably Isaiah would have. But he's mighty God. He's going to be a mighty warrior on the battlefield, able to devise these strategies and then defeat the enemy. And he's also the everlasting Father. And you might think, everlasting Father, that's a title for God. Whoa, you need to be careful here. You're waltzing into heresy if you go that way. Remember the Trinity? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You do not want to say that there's one person with 3 different manifestations. That's a heresy. So we don't want to call the Son the Father. The Father and Son are distinct persons. So I don't think we should think in Trinitarian terms here. It's too early for that. Okay? So in what sense is this king the everlasting Father? Well, in the ancient Near East, sometimes kings would talk about themselves as fathers or mothers to their people. In fact, there's an inscription from this basic time period where a particular king named Azitawada describes himself this way. So kings were fathers in the sense that they would care for the people beneath them. And so this king is going to care for his people like a father would. So I don't think this is Trinitarian here. This is just talking about the fact that this king is going to be a protector of his people. And then ultimately he's going to be the Prince of Peace. And I don't see the king here, with a little olive leaf in his teeth with, the peace sign. How has he won peace? By annihilating the enemy. So he's a mighty king who's going to bring peace. He's going to bring security and blessing for his people by defeating their enemies. So this is the ideal king that is envisioned here. Immanuel was a foreshadowing of him, and he, of course, eventually comes in Jesus. I think that in ancient Israel they probably attached the hope of this to each new Davidic king who came along, Hezekiah initially. But it didn't take very long to realize, no, this isn't really the vision we expected. And notice verse 7, his dominion will be vast. He will bring immeasurable prosperity. He will rule on David's throne and over David's kingdom, establishing it and strengthening it by promoting justice and fairness from this time forward and forevermore. The Lord's intense devotion to his people will accomplish this. He's going to be a Davidic king. And of course in the Gospels, especially Matthew, there's an emphasis on Jesus as the son of David. He is that Davidic king. And in Luke, in the early hymns, there's this hope of a Davidic king. So Jesus is the one who's going to fulfill this. So hopefully I've shown you how chapter 7 and chapter 9 are related. Let's move on to Isaiah chapter 11, which really develops this in more detail. What happens in Isaiah? He goes back into judgment mode a little bit in the last part of chapter 9, after this glorious vision of this coming king. And then in chapter 10, we're going back and forth between judgment and salvation. But then this section is going to end with a glorious vision of this king again in chapter 11. And notice chapter 11, verse 1, a shoot will grow out of Jesse's rootstock. A bud will sprout from his roots. This is an ideal king who's going to bring peace. And notice there is a depiction here of a new David. Notice he doesn't say David's rootstock, he said Jesse's. It's almost like he wants to picture this king as a new David. And you get this elsewhere in the Old Testament. I've listed some passages on page 20, down toward the bottom, a little note there. Other prophets call this coming ideal King David, or picture him as the second coming of David. Jeremiah and Ezekiel just talk about this king who's coming. They refer to him as David. Some people who take things very, very literally see it as the resurrected David in the kingdom. Possible. But if you look at what he does, it sounds a lot like what Messiah is going to do. So I think it's just a poetic way of saying the Messiah is going to be the ideal David. Sometimes the Messiah is called the son of David. In some texts, they even go so far as to refer to him as David. So he's going to come. The Lord's Spirit will rest on him. He's going to have the Spirit of the Lord, a spirit that gives extraordinary wisdom. Actually, two words in Hebrew, wisdom and understanding. Sometimes they'll pair synonyms like that, wisdom and understanding, to emphasize he's going to be really, really wise. And so that's why we refer to him as having extraordinary wisdom in the Net translation. It's also going to be a spirit of counsel and might. There we go with this counsel idea again. But also might, gevurah. And so he's going to be able to have the ability to plan and then execute those plans. This is kind of military terminology again. It's parallel to chapter 9. And then the spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. Knowledge and the fear of the Lord. Knowledge is sometimes used in the Old Testament a little bit differently than we use it. I think of having knowledge as I've got a lot of facts in my head. But in the Old Testament, to know the Lord often means to recognize his authority and obey him. So it's a specific type of knowledge. It's a recognition of God's sovereignty over your life. The famous passage in Jeremiah chapter 22 where it's talking about Josiah. He took care of the poor and the needy. Isn't this what it means to know me? See, if you know God, you recognize his authority, you know what he expects of you, and you obey him. Jesus uses it the same way. If you know the Father, you will obey him. If you love the Father, you will obey him. So in this context, knowledge is obedience. It's submission to God's will. And fear of the Lord also means you recognize his authority over you. So this king will have the Spirit, and he will have extraordinary wisdom. He will have the ability to execute plans, especially on the battlefield. And he will have absolute loyalty to the Lord. That's what knowing the Lord and fearing the Lord refers to here. He will take delight in obeying the Lord. Say, next verse. He will not judge by mere appearances or make decisions on the basis of hearsay. He will treat the poor fairly and make right decisions for the downtrodden of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth and order the wicked to be executed. So what's he doing here? He's establishing justice on the earth as well as peace. Justice will be like a belt around his waist. Integrity will be like a belt around his hips. I find myself these days praying every day, Lord, thy kingdom come. I want to see this. Don't you? Justice and peace as we read on. And then it gets really amazing. A wolf will reside with a lamb, and a leopard will lie down with a young goat. An ox and a young lion will graze together as a small child leads them along. A cow and a bear will graze together. Their young will lie down together. A lion, like an ox, will eat straw. A baby will play over the hole of a snake. Over the nest of a serpent, an infant will put his hand. They will no longer injure or destroy on my entire royal mountain, for there will be universal or global submission to the Lord's sovereignty, just as the waters completely cover the sea. That's a wonderful passage. And I used to interpret it a certain way. The transformation of the animal kingdom, I used to see that as strictly figurative in this context. In other words, what the passage is really talking about in the kingdom of justice, we won't have people oppressing other people anymore. We won't have the lions, as it were, the dishonest oppressors. We won't have them oppressing the lamb anymore, the innocent victims. I saw it as strictly figurative. But in the larger canonical context of the Bible, I'm really not there anymore. Paul in Romans 8 talks about the whole creation groaning, waiting for the day of redemption. And then I started studying Job and God's speech to Job in Job 38 and 39. And God seems to say to Job, look at the animals. God gets criticized for this, by the way. People say, why is God talking about animals? Job wants to know about justice. Earlier in the book, I think back in chapter 12, when Job was talking to his so-called friends, he said to them, go to the animals. You can learn things from the animals. Okay, God's taking him up on that. Yeah, you can learn some things from the animals. Take a good look. The way the world is created, there's a lot of conflict and tension. And some animals are predators, and they kill other animals. And God talks about this to Job. I remember I had a dog named Mickey when I was a kid. Great dog. But he was part German Shepherd and part Beagle, and he liked to hunt woodchucks. And it was amazing. He would bark at me because he liked an audience. So I would go out with him when he's going to go hunting. And he knew where the woodchucks were located. They always had 2 holes. And they would feed in between the holes. And he would intuitively know which way the wind was blowing, and he would always stay downwind. If he had to circle way around, he'd do it. And then he'd lie in the grass. And he'd just lie in the grass and wait. And the woodchucks would emerge, and they'd get about halfway. And he'd wait until they got halfway, and then he'd get up. And if the woodchuck showed any sign that it sensed something, he'd just freeze. And then he'd start moving slowly, slowly, slowly. And then when he thought he had just the right distance and just the right time, boom! It was like a rocket. And it was a mad dash to see if he could get the woodchuck before the woodchuck got in the hole. For you woodchuck fans, the woodchucks won most of the time. Mickey gets so mad he'd dig down into the hole until you hear a yelp. The woodchuck just bit him on the nose. But if he got the woodchuck, it was over quickly. And I watched my dog, and I learned a lot of lessons. I learned patience, strategy. I learned caution from the wood. I learned a lot of lessons from watching the animals. But there was always this dark side to this laboratory. Why would God create something, my dog, that is a born killer? I mean, that's what he was. He was a born killer. He knew how to hunt and kill. And the woodchuck, it seemed like, was just there for Mickey's enjoyment. William Blake's great poem, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright, he brings this out. Did the same Creator, the same God who made the lamb, make the tiger? I don't understand this. And I think my interpretation of this is it didn't happen with the fall. Job seems to say that creation itself has woven into it this tension and this conflict. And I think it mirrors the conflict that was already in the universe before God ever created the world with Satan. And the world sort of reflects that conflict. But here's the good news. Jesus came to redeem this. The Messianic King is going to bring into place a kingdom where even the animal world that reminds us of the spiritual conflict that exists is going to be transformed. And so it's a wonderful passage. And I take it more literally now. Some of my professor-type colleagues might still disagree with me, but I take it more literally now. I see this transformation of the creation that Paul talks about as mirroring what God is going to do. This is what we have to look forward to. And also, it still has symbolic value. It's a picture of what's happening in the human realm. But someday, Jesus is going to create a kingdom where there's no more oppression. There's no more victims. There's going to be perfect justice and there's going to be perfect peace. And that's something to look forward to.
I hope you enjoyed this second of a three-part series on Isaiah. In his next session, Dr. Chisholm moves from how to understand Isaiah's messianic passages to how to interpret Isaiah's servant songs, passages like Isaiah 42 and Isaiah 53. In the meantime, I trust you will have a great day.